In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like waves upon cosmic shores, there exists a truth that even the mightiest predators fear to acknowledge. Never underestimate the fury of a species that protects its young. The Zephyrians had ruled the Outer Rim for 3 millennia, their massive forms and crystalline scales earning them the nickname dragons among the lesser species they dominated. They believed themselves apex predators, untouchable in their superiority. They had never encountered humans before that fateful day on Colony Station Artemis 7. They should have done their research. What they witnessed in those 36 minutes would shatter everything they thought they knew about power, about survival, and about the terrifying lengths one species would go to protect a single child. The universe was about to learn why humanity had earned its place among the stars, not through conquest, but through something far more dangerous: love transformed into unstoppable rage. Some mistakes can never be undone. Some lines should never be crossed. And some species are best left sleeping. The dragons were about to wake something that had been quietly spreading across the galaxy, something that appeared harmless until you threatened what it held most dear. They were about to discover why humans called their homeworld Earth, but their children called the entire universe home. The observation deck of the Zephyrian battlecruiser Stellar Dominance hummed with the low-frequency vibrations that indicated maximum power flow to the ship's sensor arrays. Commander Thexkar stood motionless, his 12-foot frame casting long shadows across the polished deck plating. His crystalline scales, each one the size of a human hand, caught the light from the main viewing portal and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the walls. The effect would have been beautiful to most species, but beauty was not a concept the Zephyrians understood or valued. What they valued was strength. What they respected was power. What they feared was nothing at all. Thexkar had earned his position through 3 centuries of unwavering dominance in the Outer Rim territories. His ship and crew had subdued 47 different worlds, bringing them under Zephyrian rule through methods that were both efficient and brutal. The commander's reputation preceded him to every system they encountered, and surrender often came before the first shot was fired. This was how the natural order worked. The strong ruled, the weak submitted, and the universe maintained its proper balance. Today's mission was routine by Zephyrian standards. Colony Station Artemis 7 represented a minor irritation in their expansion plans, a small outpost that had refused to acknowledge Zephyrian authority despite 3 formal warnings. The station housed approximately 800 beings from various species, primarily engaged in what appeared to be scientific research and peaceful trade. Such activities were permitted under Zephyrian law, provided the appropriate tribute was paid and proper submission was demonstrated. The humans who operated the station had done neither. Status report. Thexkar commanded, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that marked him as a member of the warrior caste. His words resonated through the bridge, felt as much as heard by every crew member present. Subcommander Velnara approached with the measured gait of a subordinate who understood her place in the hierarchy. Her scales, while impressive by most species standards, lacked the deep blue coloration that marked Thexkar as a supreme predator. The station continues to ignore our communications, Commander. They have not powered down their defenses or opened their docking bays for inspection. Thexkar's inner eyelids flickered, a sign of mild annoyance. Duration of non-compliance? 17 standard hours since our arrival in system, Commander. We have transmitted the standard dominance protocols 4 times, each with increasing power to ensure the message was received clearly. And their response? A single transmission on an open frequency, Commander. Text only, no audio or visual components. Velnara paused, her scales shifting to a slightly darker shade that indicated uncertainty. The message was brief. It stated simply, "We do not recognize your authority and will not comply with your demands." A low rumble began deep in Thexkar's chest, the sound that had terrified countless species across the Outer Rim. It was not quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something far more threatening, the sound of controlled violence preparing to be unleashed. Unacceptable. Prepare the boarding pods. We will demonstrate to these humans why compliance is not optional. The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency, their movements synchronized through centuries of working together. Zephyrian society valued cooperation within the hierarchy, and each member of the crew knew their role perfectly. Weapon systems came online with a distinctive whine of charging energy. Boarding pods were loaded with combat troops, each warrior eager to prove their worth in battle. Navigation prepared approach vectors that would minimize the station's ability to defend itself. Thexkar watched the preparations with satisfaction. This would be another routine demonstration of Zephyrian superiority, another victory to add to his already impressive record. The humans would learn, as all species eventually did, that resistance was futile. They would submit, pay tribute, and accept their place in the natural order. Those who fought would die quickly. Those who submitted would live to serve, and the universe would continue to function as it should. The first boarding pod launched 18 minutes after the final warning was transmitted. Thexkar monitored the assault through the tactical displays, watching as his warriors moved through the station with characteristic efficiency. The humans had prepared defenses, but they were primitive and ineffective against Zephyrian combat techniques. Blast doors that could stop most species' weapons melted under the focused plasma beams of Zephyrian infantry weapons. Security personnel who might have been formidable against other threats were simply overwhelmed by the physical superiority of his troops. The resistance lasted exactly 47 minutes before the last human defender was neutralized. Station secured. Commander, came the report from squad leader Kreshnek. Minimal casualties among our forces. The humans fought with unexpected determination, but lacked the capability to pose any real threat. Acceptable. Begin the compliance demonstration. Select appropriate subjects, and ensure the remaining population observes the consequences of resistance. This was standard procedure. A public demonstration served two purposes. It satisfied the Zephyrian need to assert dominance, and it ensured that any future resistance would be minimal. The process was ritualized, almost ceremonial in its execution. A few representatives of the defeated population would be selected for punishment, their suffering would serve as an example to the others, and submission would follow naturally. Thexkar settled back to observe the proceedings through the ship's advanced monitoring systems. The demonstration would be broadcast throughout the station, ensuring maximum psychological impact. He had witnessed hundreds of such displays over the centuries, and they never failed to achieve their intended effect. Fear was a universal language, understood by every sentient species in the galaxy. The main viewing screen flickered to life, showing the interior of what appeared to be the station's main assembly area. His warriors had efficiently gathered the surviving population, approximately 723 individuals representing 14 different species. They stood in organized rows, their body language clearly indicating submission and fear. This was exactly as it should be. Squad leader Kreshnek appeared on the screen, his massive form dominating the view as he addressed the gathered prisoners. Citizens of this station, you have chosen to resist the lawful authority of the Zephyrian Empire. This resistance has been noted and will be corrected. To ensure proper understanding of your new situation, a demonstration of consequences will now be provided. The camera angle shifted to show three figures being brought forward from the crowd. Thexkar noted with professional interest that his troops had selected well. The subjects represented different species and age groups, ensuring that every member of the population would have someone to identify with during the demonstration. The first subject was a Centaurian male, middle-aged by his species standards, who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Probably an administrator or scientist of some importance. The second was an elderly Vularian female, her feathers dulled with age, but her eyes still bright with intelligence. A teacher, perhaps, or a keeper of cultural knowledge. The third subject made Thexkar pause. She was human, clearly a juvenile by the proportions of her body and the structure of her face. Humans were a relatively new species to Zephyrian attention, and their developmental stages were not well documented. But even without specific knowledge, it was obvious that this individual was very young. She stood perhaps 4.5 feet tall, with long brown hair that had been carefully braided and pale skin that suggested limited exposure to harsh environmental conditions. Her clothing was simple but clean, and she carried herself with the kind of innocent curiosity that marked the truly young of most species. For a moment, something unfamiliar stirred in Thexkar's consciousness. It was not quite recognition, not quite understanding, but a vague awareness that this situation was somehow different from the usual compliance demonstrations. The feeling passed quickly, dismissed as irrelevant to the task at hand. Age was not a factor in establishing dominance. The lesson would be taught regardless of the student's characteristics. The demonstration began with the Centaurian male. Kreshnek used standard techniques, applying precisely calculated amounts of pain to demonstrate Zephyrian capability without causing immediate death. The subject's responses were typical, initial defiance giving way to submission as the reality of his situation became clear. The watching population reacted as expected, with mounting fear and resignation. The elderly Valerian followed a similar pattern, though her responses were more subdued due to her advanced age and natural dignity. She endured the demonstration with remarkable composure, offering no resistance and showing minimal reaction to the pain being inflicted. Her stoicism seemed to have a calming effect on the watching crowd, which was counterproductive to the demonstration's goals. Then came the human child. Thexkar leaned forward as Kreshnek approached the small figure. The girl showed no signs of understanding what was about to happen to her. She looked around the assembly area with wide eyes, taking in the crowd of frightened beings and the imposing forms of the Zephyrian warriors with the kind of innocent fascination that suggested she had never encountered true danger before. When Kreshnek reached for her, she actually smiled and tried to touch his scales with a small, curious hand. The squad leader paused, clearly uncertain how to proceed. In all his centuries of military service, he had never encountered a subject who approached a compliance demonstration with curiosity rather than fear. The moment stretched, and Thexkar could sense his warrior's confusion through the communication link. "Proceed with the demonstration," Thexkar commanded, his voice cutting through his subordinate's hesitation. What followed would haunt the memory systems of every Zephyrian who witnessed it. The child did not understand what was happening to her. As the pain began, she cried out not in defiance or anger, but in confusion and hurt. She called for her mother, for her father, for anyone who might come to help her. Her voice, high and clear, echoed through the assembly area with heartbreaking innocence. She asked questions between her cries. "Why are you hurting me? What did I do wrong? Please stop, it hurts." The watching population reacted in ways Thexkar had never seen before. Instead of the usual resignation and submission that followed compliance demonstrations, he observed something entirely different. The humans in the crowd began to struggle against their restraints with desperate fury. Other species, beings who had shown proper submission just moments before, suddenly began to move with purpose and determination. Even elderly individuals and those clearly injured in the initial assault began to push forward, trying to reach the demonstration area. His warriors moved to contain the disturbance, but their usual methods seemed suddenly inadequate. The crowd was not responding to shows of force. Fear was being replaced by something else, something that drove individuals to place themselves in harm's way without regard for their own safety. Mothers of other species pushed toward the front, their own young clutched in their arms. Fathers who had willingly surrendered their weapons now fought barehanded against armed Zephyrian troops. The demonstration continued for 36 minutes. During those 36 minutes, Thexkar observed phenomena that challenged everything he understood about dominance, submission, and the natural order of the universe. The child's suffering seemed to awaken something in every member of the watching population, regardless of species. Unity emerged from desperation, courage arose from hopelessness, and what had been a defeated and scattered group of individuals suddenly began to function as a coordinated whole. In the 23rd minute of the demonstration, a human male broke free from his restraints and managed to reach the demonstration area before being stopped. He fought 3 Zephyrian warriors simultaneously, his movements driven by desperate fury rather than training or technique. He should have been overwhelmed immediately, but somehow he continued to fight long enough to severely injure one of his opponents before being subdued. In the 31st minute, an elderly Procyon female, a species known for their pacifist philosophy, attacked a Zephyrian guard with improvised weapons. Her actions triggered a cascade of resistance that spread through the crowd like a virus, infecting even those species that had no evolutionary predisposition toward violence. In the final minute of the demonstration, as the child drew her last breath, something changed in the humans that Thexkar would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. Their struggles ceased, their cries stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the assembly area. But it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a predator that had finished calculating and was preparing to strike. The child died quietly, her small hand reaching toward the crowd as if seeking comfort that would never come. Thexkar stared at the main display, experiencing an emotion he had no name for. In 3 centuries of military service, he had overseen countless compliance demonstrations. He had seen every possible reaction to Zephyrian dominance, from immediate submission to desperate last stands. But he had never seen anything like what had just occurred. The crowd stood in absolute silence, 722 beings of 14 different species, all focused on the small, still form lying in the center of the demonstration area. There was no weeping, no lamentation, no despair. There was only a vast, pregnant silence that seemed to press against the walls of the assembly area like a living thing. Kreshnek's voice crackled through the communication system, uncertainty clear in his harmonic undertones. "Commander, the demonstration is complete. The population appears to be subdued, requesting further orders." Thexkar found himself strangely reluctant to respond. Something fundamental had changed during those 36 minutes, something that his extensive military experience could not categorize or explain. The compliance demonstration had achieved its technical objectives. Resistance had been met with overwhelming consequences, dominance had been clearly established, and the population had been shown the futility of opposing Zephyrian authority. But somehow, despite the clear success of the operation, Thexkar could not shake the feeling that a terrible mistake had been made. "Maintain security positions," he finally ordered. "Monitor the population for signs of additional resistance. Report any unusual activity immediately." "Understood, Commander. Should we prepare the tribute collection protocols?" Standard procedure called for the immediate establishment of tribute requirements and submission ceremonies. The demonstration was meant to be followed by formal acknowledgement of Zephyrian authority and the beginning of regular resource extraction. But something about the continued silence from the station's population made him reluctant to proceed. "Stand by on tribute collection. Continue monitoring for now." The main display continued to show the assembly area, where the crowd remained motionless in their vigil around the child's body. Occasionally, one of the humans would step forward and gently touch the small form, their movements careful and reverent. Other species began to do the same, creating a slow, continuous procession of mourning that included beings who had never even spoken to each other before the demonstration began. Thexkar watched this unusual display with growing unease. In his experience, successful compliance demonstrations were followed by rapid submission and eager cooperation. The population should have been asking about tribute requirements, seeking ways to demonstrate their acceptance of Zephyrian authority, and working to ensure that no further demonstrations would be necessary. Instead, they stood in silence around the body of one small human child, and somehow that silence felt far more threatening than any act of open rebellion he had ever encountered. Hours passed. The crowd never dispersed. They took turns maintaining their vigil, but the assembly area was never empty. Someone was always there, always watching, always remembering. And in the observation deck of the Stellar Dominance, Commander Thexkar found himself unable to look away from the display, gripped by the growing certainty that those 36 minutes had changed everything, and that the universe itself was about to show him just how wrong his understanding of the natural order really was. The first transmission left Colony Station Artemis, 7 exactly 43 minutes after the child died. It was a simple data packet compressed and encrypted using quantum entanglement protocols that few species in the galaxy fully understood. The transmission lasted less than 2 seconds, moving faster than light through the established human communication network that connected hundreds of worlds across known space. To the Zephyrian monitoring systems aboard the Stellar Dominance, it appeared as nothing more than routine maintenance traffic between station systems. They were catastrophically wrong. Dr. Sarah Chun had been hiding in the station's secondary communication array when the assault began. As the head of Xenocommunications research for the Artemis Colony Project, she understood better than most how to remain undetected when advanced species conducted their scans. The Zephyrians were thorough, but they were also arrogant, and their arrogance had created blind spots in their search patterns. Sarah had watched the entire demonstration through her hidden monitoring equipment. She had seen her colleagues die with dignity and courage. She had watched beings from 14 different species unite in shared horror and determination. And she had witnessed the murder of Emma Patterson, age 12, daughter of colony administrators David and Margaret Patterson, student at the Artemis Youth Academy, amateur artist, aspiring xenobiologist, and the single most important catalyst for change the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years. The transmission Sarah sent was not a cry for help. It was not a distress signal or a plea for rescue. It was something far more dangerous than any of those things. It was a notification delivered to a network that the Zephyrians had never bothered to map or understand because they had never considered humans worth the effort. The Human Communication Network was not a military system. It was not controlled by any government or organization. It existed as a loose confederation of civilian communication relays, scientific research stations, exploration vessels, trading outposts, and colonial settlements. It had grown organically over the centuries of human expansion, connecting communities across vast distances with the simple purpose of keeping families, friends, and colleagues in touch with each other. What made the network truly remarkable was not its technology, but its coverage. Humans were everywhere in the galaxy, not as conquerors or rulers, but as researchers, traders, explorers, teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, and simply as people trying to make lives for themselves among the stars. They were the species that everyone else barely noticed, the ones who appeared harmless and unimportant, the ones who could be found in every corner of civilized space without anyone paying them much attention. The Zephyrians had made the fatal error of assuming that because humans posed no apparent threat, they were not connected to each other in meaningful ways. They had failed to understand that the most dangerous networks are often the ones that appear most innocent. Sarah's transmission reached the first relay station within minutes. From there, it spread across the network like ripples across a still pond, moving from node to node with ever-increasing speed as automated systems recognized the priority in coding and began allocating additional bandwidth. The message was simple, direct, and absolutely clear. Asterisk Emergency Protocol 7. Child murdered during compliance demonstration. Colony Station Artemis 7. Coordinates attached. All stations acknowledge and relay. Asterisk Emergency Protocol 7 had been established during the early years of human expansion when isolated colonies faced threats that formal military channels could not address quickly enough. It was designed to mobilize civilian resources across the network for mutual aid and protection. It had been invoked only 12 times in human history, and never for a situation quite like this. The first acknowledgement came from Kepler Station, a research facility studying pulsar emissions 3 systems away. The message was received by Dr. James Morrison, a quantum physicist who had never met Emma Patterson, but who had children of his own. Dr. Morrison took exactly 37 seconds to verify the authentication codes, confirm the transmission's legitimacy, and forward the alert to 17 additional stations in his network sector. The second acknowledgement came from the merchant vessel Distant Shore, currently carrying medical supplies to a Procyon colony suffering from an epidemic outbreak. Captain Maria Santos read the message twice, checked the attached coordinates against her current position, and began calculating course corrections that would bring her ship within striking distance of Artemis 7 within 6 days. She also activated the Merchant Emergency Network, which connected trading vessels across half the galaxy. The third acknowledgement came from Haven Colony, an agricultural world that specialized in feeding refugee populations displaced by the various conflicts that periodically swept through the Outer Rim. Administrator Tom Bradley was in the middle of negotiating crop distribution schedules when a priority alert interrupted his communication session. He read the message in complete silence, closed his eyes for a moment, and then began activating Haven Colony's considerable resource mobilization protocols. Within 2 hours of Sarah's initial transmission, the message had reached 37 human outposts, stations, colonies, and vessels. Each recipient followed the same general pattern: verify, acknowledge, relay, and begin preparing whatever resources they had available for potential deployment. The network was not centrally coordinated, but it didn't need to be. The humans who received the alert understood what it meant, and they responded with the kind of unified purpose that species across the galaxy had learned to underestimate at their own peril. Dr. Rebecca Foster was serving as the chief medical officer aboard the deep space research vessel Darwin's Dream when the alert reached her. She was 3 weeks into a 6-month mission studying gravitational anomalies in an uninhabited system, with a crew of 47 scientists and support personnel. The message found her in the middle of treating a minor injury suffered by one of the engineering staff, and she finished cleaning the wound before taking the time to read her incoming communications. When she finally opened the priority alert, her hands stopped moving. Rebecca had served as a combat medic during the Rigel border conflicts 15 years earlier. She had seen death and suffering on a scale that most civilians could never imagine. She had treated casualties from dozens of different species, and she thought she had developed the kind of professional detachment that allowed medical personnel to function in crisis situations. But reading the clinical details of what had been done to a human child in the name of establishing dominance triggered something in her that her military training had never prepared her to handle. She found Captain Williams in his ready room, reviewing stellar cartography data for their next survey destination. He was a calm, methodical man who had spent 20 years in deep space exploration without ever encountering a situation that required more than careful planning and patient execution. The expression on Rebecca's face when she entered his cabin told him that their careful, methodical mission was about to change dramatically. "We're receiving a Priority 7 alert from the Human Communication Network," Rebecca said without preamble. "Colony Station Artemis 7 has been attacked by Zephyrian forces. A 12-year-old girl was tortured and murdered during their compliance demonstration." Captain Williams set down his datapad and looked at her carefully. Rebecca Foster was not the kind of person who exaggerated or allowed emotion to cloud her judgment. If she said that a Priority 7 alert was legitimate, then it was legitimate. "What's our current distance from their position?" 4 days at maximum acceleration. "We have 47 people aboard, no military equipment, and scientific instruments that were never designed for combat applications." Rebecca paused, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "John, they killed a child. Deliberately. As an example to the others." The captain stood and walked to his viewing port, staring out at the star field beyond. In 20 years of deep space service, he had developed a reputation for making careful, rational decisions based on complete analysis of available data. This was not a situation that lent itself to careful or rational analysis. This was a situation that demanded an immediate response from the heart rather than the head. "Alter course for Artemis 7, he ordered. "Maximum acceleration. Prepare all personnel for emergency deployment." "Sir, what exactly are we planning to do when we arrive? We're not a warship. We're not even armed beyond basic defensive systems." Captain Williams turned back to face her, and Rebecca saw something in his eyes that reminded her of her own military service. It was the look of someone who had decided that some things were more important than survival. "We're going to do whatever needs to be done, Doctor. And we're not going to be doing it alone." Similar conversations were taking place on human vessels and installations across the galaxy. The Priority 7 alert was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, reaching farther into the network than the most optimistic planners had ever projected. What had started as a simple notification was becoming something unprecedented in the history of human expansion, a species-wide mobilization in response to an attack on a single child. The Starfire Express, a passenger liner carrying 600 civilians to New Geneva Colony, diverted to Artemis 7 despite having no military capability whatsoever. The Prometheus, a heavy cargo hauler loaded with mining equipment bound for the Centauri Industrial Complex, altered course and began distributing weapons to her crew from emergency storage lockers. Research Station Beta 9, a deep space astronomical observatory with a crew of 12, began broadcasting continuous updates to every ship within 10 light-years of their position. As the hours passed, the scope of the response began to exceed every projection and precedent. Ships that should have been days away from each other were coordinating their movements with military precision. Civilians with no combat training were volunteering for assault teams. Scientists were jury-rigging their equipment for tactical applications. Medical personnel were preparing for casualty loads that their facilities had never been designed to handle. And through it all, the message continued to spread. Dr. Elena Vasquez was the director of the Titan Research Collective, a massive scientific installation in the Outer Rim that employed over 2,000 researchers from 43 different species. The collective was neutral territory by interspecies treaty, a place where beings from across the galaxy could work together on projects that transcended political and military boundaries. When the Priority 7 alert reached her office, Elena was in the middle of mediating a dispute between Vularian theoretical physicists and Centaurian experimental engineers over the proper methodology for studying quantum dimensional intersections. The alert interrupted her mediation session with its distinctive priority signal. Elena opened the message, read it quickly, and then read it again more slowly. The argument between the physicists and engineers gradually faded to silence as they realized that something had captured their director's complete attention. Dr. Vasquez? Dr. Tvek, the lead Vularian researcher, inquired with the kind of polite concern that his species was known for. Is there some difficulty? Elena looked up at the assembled researchers, humans, Vularians, Centaurians, Procyon, and half a dozen other species who had been working together for years on projects that would benefit everyone. These beings trusted each other with their lives on a daily basis, sharing knowledge and resources without regard for species boundaries. They were exactly the kind of diverse, cooperative community that the galaxy needed more of, and they were about to learn that such communities could be destroyed by anyone with sufficient firepower and complete lack of conscience. A human colony has been attacked, she said simply. During the assault, a 12-year-old girl was tortured and killed as a demonstration of power. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena watched as beings from multiple species processed the information, their various biological and cultural responses creating a symphony of horror and disbelief. Dr. Tvek's feathers shifted to the dark blue that indicated deep distress among his people. The Centaurian engineers, normally impassive, began the low harmonic humming that served as their expression of grief. Even the Procyonians, whose emotional responses were typically muted, showed clear signs of disturbance. This act was performed by whom? Dr. Tvek asked, his voice carefully controlled but carrying undertones of something that sounded remarkably like anger. Zephyrian forces. They were conducting what they call a compliance demonstration to establish dominance over the station's population. Dr. Sarah Kim, a human xenobiologist, spoke from the back of the room. The message includes coordinates and a request for emergency assistance under Priority 7 protocols. Elena nodded slowly. The Titan Research Collective was officially neutral, bound by interspecies treaties that prevented it from taking sides in political or military conflicts. But those treaties had been written by diplomats and politicians who had never been forced to consider what their rules meant when applied to the murder of children. I'm going to ask for a vote, she announced. All in favor of suspending our neutrality protocols and providing assistance to Artemis 7. The vote was unanimous. Dr. Tvek was the first to speak after the vote was recorded. The Vularian research vessels Brightwing and Swift Current are currently docked at our primary station. Both ships are equipped for deep space travel and can be ready for departure within 6 hours. Dr. Mkaras, the senior Centaurian engineer, added his own contribution. Our heavy transport Iron Mountain has recently been equipped with the new defensive shield generators. She could serve as a mobile base of operations for rescue efforts. Similar offers came from representatives of every species present. Within an hour, the Titan Research Collective had transformed itself from a neutral scientific installation into a multi-species task force preparing for humanitarian intervention. The change was so rapid and complete that Elena found herself wondering whether the neutrality had ever been anything more than a convenient fiction. As the preparations continued, Elena made a personal decision that would have profound implications for everything that followed. She activated her personal communication system and sent a message of her own into the network, not to humans specifically, but to research installations and scientific communities across the galaxy. Her message was simple but extraordinarily dangerous from a diplomatic perspective. Asterisk Titan Research Collective is mobilizing all available resources to respond to atrocity committed against civilian population at Colony Station Artemis 7. All scientific and humanitarian organizations are invited to coordinate efforts for mutual aid and protection. This is not a human issue. This is a universal issue. Details attached. Asterisk Elena's message reached research facilities operated by dozens of different species. It was forwarded to academic institutions, medical centers, scientific societies, and cultural organizations that had never considered themselves political entities. But Elena's message changed that by framing the situation not as a human problem, but as a threat to the principles of civilization itself. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the small crisis at a minor human colony had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. Ships from 30 different species were altering course toward the Artemis system. Medical facilities were preparing to receive casualties. Research installations were sharing technical data that had never been disclosed outside their own species. Cultural organizations were offering resources that had been held in trust for centuries. The network that had started as a simple human communication system was rapidly evolving into something that connected every corner of civilized space. And at the center of it all, growing stronger with each passing hour, was a shared understanding that some lines could never be crossed without consequences that extended far beyond any single species or world. Meanwhile, aboard the Stellar Dominance, Commander Thexkar continued to monitor the silent vigil in the station's assembly area, completely unaware that his 36 minutes of routine dominance demonstration had triggered a mobilization that was spreading across the galaxy like wildfire. The Zephyrian detection systems, designed to monitor military communications and fleet movements, were blind to the civilian networks that connected species across vast distances for purposes that had nothing to do with warfare. The Dragons had awakened something, and they had no idea what was coming for them. The first ship to arrive at the Artemis system was not what anyone expected. The Moonlight Serenade was a luxury cruise liner that normally transported wealthy tourists to see the spectacular aurora phenomena around the gas giant Kepler 442b. She was not designed for combat, carried no military equipment, and her crew of 43 had exactly zero experience with hostile engagement protocols. Captain Lisa Rodriguez had diverted from her scheduled route purely on the strength of the Priority 7 alert, bringing her 168 passengers into a potentially lethal situation based on nothing more than the conviction that abandoning a human colony was not an option. The Moonlight Serenade dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Artemis system, her sensors immediately detecting the imposing presence of the Zephyrian battlecruiser Stellar Dominance. The contrast between the two vessels could not have been more dramatic. One a sleek, peaceful transport designed for comfort and sightseeing, the other a massive warship bristling with weapons that could reduce entire planets to glowing slag. Captain Rodriguez stood on her bridge, staring at the tactical display that showed the relative positions of the two ships. Her passengers included retired teachers, artists, wealthy dilettantes seeking exotic experiences, and a small group of xenoanthropologists who had booked passage to study the cultural exchanges at various trade stations. None of them had signed up for a confrontation with one of the galaxy's most feared military species. Captain, her first officer, Commander Sarah Kim, spoke quietly from her station. "We're receiving a communication from the Zephyrian vessel. They're ordering us to maintain distance and await escort to a holding position." Lisa looked around her bridge at the crew members who had followed her into this impossible situation. These were people who had spent their careers ensuring that tourists had pleasant and safe experiences while viewing the wonders of the galaxy. They had expertise in hospitality management, recreational activities coordination, and customer service protocols. They had no business confronting a species that considered casual murder to be an acceptable form of diplomacy. "Ignore their transmission," she ordered. "Begin approach to the colony station. All passengers to emergency stations." "Captain, we don't have weapons. We don't have shields worth mentioning. If they decide to fire on us..." Commander Kim left the sentence unfinished, but everyone on the bridge understood what she was not saying. "Then we die," Lisa said simply. "But we don't abandon our people. Signal the station. Let them know help is on the way." The Moonlight Serenade began her approach to Colony Station Artemis 7 at a sedate pace that reflected her design limitations rather than any tactical consideration. As she drew closer, her sensors began picking up additional details about the situation. The station showed signs of battle damage, but its main structure appeared intact. There were no signs of ongoing combat, which suggested that the initial assault had been successful and that Zephyrian forces were now in control. Most importantly, life support systems were still functioning. People were still alive on that station. The second ship to arrive was the heavy cargo hauler Iron Mountain, dispatched from the Titan Research Collective with a crew that included beings from 7 different species. Unlike the cruise liner, the Iron Mountain was equipped with industrial-grade defensive systems and carried equipment that could be rapidly converted for tactical applications. Her captain, Dr. Mkaras of the Centauri Engineering Guild, had spent the journey from Titan researching everything available in the collective databases about Zephyrian military capabilities and standard operational procedures. The results of his research were not encouraging. Zephyrian warships were designed around the principle of overwhelming superiority. They were larger, more heavily armed, and more heavily shielded than anything operated by the species they typically encountered. Their tactics were based on the assumption that resistance was futile, and their equipment was optimized for rapid subjugation rather than extended combat. They did not negotiate, they did not accept surrender on terms other than their own, and they did not show mercy to those who opposed them. On paper, the Iron Mountain and the Moonlight Serenade combined could not pose even a minor threat to a Zephyrian battlecruiser. Their weapons were inadequate, their defenses were insufficient, and their crews were untrained for military operations. Any rational analysis of the situation would conclude that they were heading toward their own destruction with no possibility of achieving their objectives. Dr. Mkaras was a Centaurian, and Centaurians were known throughout the galaxy for their logical, methodical approach to problem-solving. They did not make emotional decisions, they did not take unnecessary risks, and they certainly did not engage in futile gestures that served no practical purpose. Which was why his next communication surprised everyone on both ships. * Moonlight Serenade *, this is Iron Mountain. We are proceeding to attack formation. Recommend you maintain current approach vector and prepare to provide humanitarian assistance to station personnel. Captain Rodriguez stared at her communication display in disbelief. Did he just say attack formation? Commander Kim checked her readings twice before responding. Yes, Captain. The cargo hauler is moving to a position that would allow them to engage the Zephyrian vessel directly. With what? Industrial mining equipment. Apparently so, Captain. The third ship to arrive was the research vessel Darwin's Dream, her hull scarred from months of deep space exploration, and her crew grim with determination that had been building during their 4-day journey to the crisis zone. Dr. Rebecca Foster had used the time to prepare medical facilities for casualties they couldn't treat, while Captain Williams had worked with his engineers to modify their scientific equipment for purposes its designers had never intended. What Captain Williams had discovered during the journey was that scientific instruments could be remarkably dangerous when used creatively. Gravitational wave detectors could be reconfigured to disrupt enemy sensors. Particle accelerators designed for physics experiments could be modified into weapons that would surprise anyone expecting conventional tactics. Most importantly, the Darwin's Dream carried experimental communication jammers that could interfere with even the most advanced military networks. The 3 ships formed an unlikely flotilla as they approached Colony Station Artemis, 7 together. Their combined crews totaled fewer than 300 beings, representing multiple species with no unified command structure and no coordinated battle plan. They were facing a military vessel designed to subjugate entire planets, operated by a crew with centuries of combat experience, and equipped with weapons that could destroy all 3 civilian ships simultaneously. From any rational perspective, the situation was hopeless. Aboard the Stellar Dominance, Commander Thexkar watched the approaching ships with a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. In 3 centuries of military service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. Enemy fleets approached with battle formations and tactical coordination. Pirates struck with stealth and rapid attack patterns. Desperate defenders fought from fortified positions with everything they had available. He had never seen civilian ships approach a warship in what could only be described as an improvised attack formation, showing no apparent awareness of how outmatched they were, and no apparent intention of negotiating or withdrawing. Analysis, he ordered. Sub-Commander Velnara consulted her tactical displays with the efficiency that marked her as a career military professional. 3 vessels. Total mass approximately 1/10 of our own. Minimal weaponry, primarily civilian-grade defensive systems. Crew estimates suggest fewer than 300 individuals across all ships. No military formations or standardized equipment visible. Species identification. Mixed crews, Commander. Humans, Centaurians, Vularians, and several others. No indication of formal military alliance or unified command structure. Thexkar considered this information carefully. The Zephyrian Empire had established its dominance through superior force applied with overwhelming efficiency. They did not waste time with minor threats, but they also did not ignore potential challenges to their authority. The proper response to this situation should have been a brief demonstration of firepower, followed by the destruction of all 3 approaching vessels. But something about the situation felt wrong to him. These ships were not approaching like attackers or even like desperate defenders. They were approaching like rescuers, like beings who had come to help their own kind and were prepared to die for that purpose rather than abandon their objective. Thexkar had seen desperation before. He had seen courage and determination and hopeless last stands by beings who chose to die rather than submit. But this was something different. These ships were approaching with a kind of calm certainty that suggested they knew something he did not. Open a communication channel to the lead vessel, he ordered. The main viewing screen flickered to life, showing the bridge of the crew's liner Moonlight Serenade. Thexkar found himself looking at a human female who appeared to be middle-aged by her species standards, wearing the uniform of a civilian transport captain. She stood behind what was clearly a luxury vessel's bridge, surrounded by crew members whose training was obviously oriented toward passenger service rather than military operations. "I am Commander Thexkar of the Zephyrian Empire," he announced, using the harmonic intimidation patterns that had proven effective with every species he had previously encountered. "You are entering a restricted zone where Zephyrian authority has been established. Withdraw immediately or face destruction." The human captain looked directly into the communication display with an expression of calm determination that Thexkar found oddly unsettling. "I am Captain Lisa Rodriguez of the Moonlight Serenade. We are here to provide humanitarian assistance to the civilian population of Colony Station Artemis 7. We will not withdraw. You are outnumbered, outgunned, and completely outmatched. Your ships pose no threat to Zephyrian forces. Withdraw now and your lives will be spared. Commander Thexkar, 36 minutes ago, your forces tortured and murdered a 12-year-old child as a demonstration of power. We are not here to negotiate with you. We are here to rescue our people and to ensure that you understand the consequences of your actions." Something in a human's voice sent an unfamiliar chill through Thexkar's consciousness. It was not fear, not anger, not desperation. It was something far more dangerous. Absolute certainty combined with complete willingness to accept any consequence rather than retreat. "Captain Rodriguez, you have 3 ships and fewer than 300 crew members. I have a battlecruiser and over 2,000 warriors. You cannot possibly achieve any objective that would justify the deaths you are about to cause. Commander, you're not understanding the situation correctly. We're not 3 ships. We're the first 3 ships." Before Thexkar could respond to this cryptic statement, his tactical officer called out an alert that changed everything. "Commander, multiple hyperspace emergence signatures detected. Range for light minutes and closing." The tactical display lit up with new contacts as ship after ship dropped out of hyperspace throughout the Artemis system. Thexkar stared at the rapidly multiplying sensor returns with growing disbelief. 5 ships became 10, then 20, then 50. The emergence signatures kept coming, spreading across the system in a pattern that spoke of coordination on a scale he had never encountered. "How many?" he demanded. "Still counting, Commander. Current total is 137 vessels, with more arriving continuously." Thexkar's military experience included campaigns against formal enemy fleets, and he had never seen anything approach this scale of mobilization. But what truly alarmed him was not the number of ships, but their nature. These were not military vessels. They were civilian transports, research ships, cargo haulers, exploration vessels, and private craft. They came from dozens of different species, showed no unified design or tactical formation, and yet they moved with a purposefulness that suggested underlying coordination. Analysis of fleet composition. He ordered, his voice carefully controlled despite the growing certainty that the situation had moved far beyond his ability to manage it with conventional tactics. Mixed civilian vessels, Commander. Approximately 60% human-operated, but significant representation from 30-plus species. Individual ship capabilities range from negligible to moderate, but combined tonnage is approaching our own mass equivalent. Thexkar absorbed this information while watching the tactical display continue to populate with new contacts. A mixed civilian fleet of this size represented something unprecedented in his military experience. Enemy fleets were predictable. They had military objectives, standard tactics, and command structures that could be analyzed and countered. But civilian fleets operating with this level of coordination suggested something he had no experience dealing with. His communication system activated again, this time showing a different bridge. This appeared to be a cargo vessel of some kind, operated by a Centaurian who wore the insignia of the Engineering Guild. The being's scaled features showed the kind of controlled intensity that Thexkar associated with technical specialists pushed beyond their normal parameters. Commander Thexkar, I am Dr. Mkaras of the research vessel Iron Mountain. I am transmitting tactical coordination data to all vessels in the system. You now face a combined fleet of over 150 ships operated by beings from 43 different species, all of whom have come here for the same purpose that brought Captain Rodriguez and her crew. And what purpose is that? Thexkar asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. To ensure that what you did to that child never happens again. To anyone. Anywhere. The communication ended, and Thexkar found himself staring at a tactical situation that defied every principle of military science he had ever studied. His ship could destroy individual vessels with ease, but the sheer number of targets made conventional engagement impossible. More importantly, these ships were not attacking him. They were simply arriving, taking positions throughout the system, and making it clear through their presence that the situation had fundamentally changed. For the first time in his military career, Commander Thexkar was facing an enemy that could not be defeated through superior firepower, because they had not come to fight him. They had come to rescue the people on the station and to demonstrate that some actions carried consequences that extended far beyond any single world or species. As he watched, the tactical display updated again. The count had reached 200 ships, with no sign that the arrivals were slowing down. In the assembly area of Colony Station Artemis 7, the silent vigil continued. But now, for the first time since Emma Patterson had died, there were signs of hope among the watching crowd. External communications had been restored, and word was spreading that help was coming. Not military assistance, not government intervention, but something far more powerful. The combined will of an entire galaxy refusing to accept that children could be murdered for the convenience of those who claimed to rule them. The dragons had awakened something, and it was bigger than they had ever imagined possible. By the 18th hour after Emma Patterson's death, 347 ships from 62 different species had gathered in the Artemis system. The fleet that assembled around Colony Station Artemis 7 defied every convention of military science and diplomatic protocol that the galaxy had established over millennia of interspecies contact. There was no unified command structure, no standardized communication system, and no formal alliance binding the participants together. What held the fleet together was something far simpler and far more dangerous than any military organization. Shared moral outrage combined with absolute determination to ensure that the child's death would not be forgotten or ignored. Commander Thexkar stood on the observation deck of the Stellar Dominance, staring out at a sight that no Zephyrian commander had ever witnessed in the entire history of their empire. The ships surrounding his position included massive research vessels operated by the Titan Science Collective, swift escort cruisers from the Procyon Merchant Alliance, heavy industrial transports from the Valerian Manufacturing Consortium, and hundreds of smaller craft representing species and organizations he had never heard of. What truly unsettled him was not their number or their diversity, but their behavior. The assembled fleet made no threatening moves toward his ship. They took no aggressive formations. They issued no ultimatums or demands. They simply surrounded the station at a respectful distance and waited, their presence serving as an undeniable statement that the situation was no longer under Zephyrian control. Status report. Thexkar commanded, his voice carrying less of the harmonic authority that normally marked his communications. 18 hours of escalating crisis had begun to erode his confidence in the natural order that had governed his understanding of the universe for centuries. Subcommander Velnara approached with information that she clearly wished she did not have to deliver. Commander, our long-range sensors are detecting additional ships approaching the system. Current estimates suggest that over 500 vessels will be present within the next 6 hours. Species analysis? The diversity continues to increase, Commander. We have identified ships from 87 different species, including several that we have never encountered before. The civilian organizations represented include scientific institutions, medical facilities, trading cooperatives, cultural preservation societies, and educational foundations. Thexkar processed this information with growing unease. Military threats could be analyzed and countered through established doctrine. Political pressures could be managed through diplomatic channels. Economic challenges could be addressed through negotiation and trade agreements. But a spontaneous mobilization of civilian populations across multiple species represented something for which Zephyrian military training provided no guidance. "What are our strategic options?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect that the conventional definition of strategic options no longer applied to his situation. "Tactically, Commander, we retain the ability to destroy individual vessels or even substantial portions of the assembled fleet. Our firepower advantage remains overwhelming against any single target. However, the sheer number of vessels present makes comprehensive engagement impossible. More significantly, our intelligence analysis suggests that destroying civilian ships would likely result in additional mobilization rather than deterring further involvement." Thexkar had reached the same conclusion through his own analysis. The fleet assembling around Artemis 7 was not motivated by military objectives or political goals. It was motivated by something that military force could not address: moral conviction. Destroying ships filled with civilians would not demonstrate Zephyrian strength. It would prove the accusations being made against them and justify even more extensive retaliation. Communication from the station. "Commander," his operations officer announced. "The survivors are requesting permission to address the assembled fleet directly." This was an unprecedented development. Standard compliance protocols called for all communication to be routed through Zephyrian command channels. Allowing defeated populations to communicate freely with outside forces violated every principle of occupation management. But the current situation had already moved so far beyond standard protocols that conventional rules seemed irrelevant. "Route the communication through our monitoring systems," Thexkar ordered. "Full analysis of content and recipients." The main viewing screen activated to show the interior of the station's assembly area. The vigil around Emma Patterson's body continued, but now it had been joined by representatives of every species present on the station. What had begun as human grief had evolved into something approaching a universal memorial service, with beings from 14 different species taking turns to honor a child they had barely known, but whose death had somehow touched them all. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the director of the Titan Research Collective, had arrived aboard one of the first rescue ships and now served as the informal coordinator for humanitarian efforts. She stood before the assembled crowd of survivors and rescue personnel, her voice calm, but carrying an undertone of absolute determination that reminded Thexkar uncomfortably of Captain Rodriguez's earlier communication. "Friends, colleagues, fellow beings of conscience," she began, her words being translated into dozens of languages by the assembled fleet's communication network. "We have come here not as conquerors or warriors, but as people who refuse to accept that children can be murdered for the convenience of those who claim authority over us." The camera angle shifted to show the faces of a listening crowd. Humans stood beside Centaurians, Valerians shared space with Procyon, and beings from species that rarely interacted worked together with natural cooperation. The diversity was remarkable, but What struck Thexkar most forcefully was the unity of expression. Every face, regardless of species, showed the same combination of grief, determination, and absolute refusal to accept what had happened. Emma Patterson was 12 years old. Dr. Vasquez continued. She wanted to be a xenobiologist. She collected art made by beings from different species and created her own works that celebrated the diversity of galactic civilization. She asked questions about everything, made friends with everyone she met, and believed that understanding between species was possible if we just took the time to really see each other. Thexkar found himself focusing on details that his military training told him were irrelevant. The child's personal interests, her artistic inclinations, her social interactions. None of these facts had any bearing on tactical analysis or strategic planning. But somehow, listening to the description of her life made the memory of her death more disturbing than it had been when he had witnessed it directly. Her death was not an accident, and it was not a casualty of military action. It was a deliberate act of torture, performed for the specific purpose of terrorizing the civilian population of this station. It was done to demonstrate that power gives the right to inflict suffering on the innocent. It was done to prove that might makes right, and that the strong have no obligations to the weak. The assembled crowd remained silent, but Thexkar could sense their emotional state through subtle changes in body language and breathing patterns. These were not beings prepared for war, but beings prepared for something potentially more dangerous, sustained, coordinated resistance based on shared moral principles. We reject this demonstration. We reject the authority that justifies it. We reject the assumption that any species has the right to murder children for any reason whatsoever. And we are here to ensure that everyone in the galaxy understands that such actions will have consequences that extend far beyond any single world or system. Dr. Vasquez paused, looking directly into the camera with an expression that seemed to be addressing not just the assembled fleet, but every being who might eventually receive the transmission. This is not about humans versus Zephyrians. This is not about military strength or political dominance. This is about the fundamental principles that allow civilized beings to share the galaxy without descending into barbarism. We are establishing the Emma Patterson Memorial Foundation, dedicated to ensuring the protection of children throughout the galaxy. Every species represented here today is contributing resources to this foundation. Every ship in this fleet is pledging ongoing support for its mission. Every organization involved is committing to a network of mutual protection that will make it impossible for what happened here to happen again anywhere else. Thexkar felt something unfamiliar stirring in his consciousness as he listened to these words. The humans and their allies were not responding to his demonstration of Zephyrian power with submission or even resistance. They were responding by creating something new, something that addressed the root causes of the situation rather than just its immediate symptoms. The foundation that Dr. Vasquez described would represent a fundamental challenge to the entire system of dominance that the Zephyrian Empire was based on. If civilian populations across the galaxy could coordinate their resources for mutual protection, if they could respond to threats with immediate, overwhelming support rather than isolated submission, then the calculations that made Zephyrian expansion possible would no longer apply. Subcommander Volnara spoke quietly from her station. We are receiving communication requests from Zephyrian High Command. They are requesting detailed reports on the current tactical situation. Thexkar considered his response carefully. High Command expected regular updates on compliance operations, but they expected those updates to follow predictable patterns. Resistance encountered, resistance overcome, dominance established, tribute collected, forces redeployed to next objective. The current situation fit none of those categories. How could he explain to the High Command that a routine compliance demonstration had triggered a galaxy-wide mobilization? How could he describe a fleet of civilian ships that posed no direct military threat, but had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the entire sector? How could he analyze an enemy that had responded to an act of aggression by creating new institutions dedicated to preventing similar aggression in the future? Delay response to High Command, he ordered. Continue monitoring situation development. The truth was that Thexkar no longer understood the situation well enough to provide meaningful analysis. His 3 centuries of military experience had not prepared him for an enemy that refused to fight him. Allies that appeared overnight from species, with no formal military cooperation, or objectives that could not be achieved or prevented through conventional application of force. On the main viewing screen, Dr. Vasquez was concluding her address to the assembled fleet. Emma Patterson died because someone with power decided that her suffering would serve their purposes. She died alone, in pain, calling for her parents who could not save her. But her death will not be meaningless if we ensure that no other child ever dies the same way. Every ship in this fleet represents a promise. Every being who has come here makes a commitment. Every organization that has contributed resources accepts an obligation. We promise that children will be protected. We commit to responding to threats against the innocent with immediate and overwhelming support. We accept the obligation to build a galaxy where power serves protection rather than domination. The Zephyrian Empire demonstrated their understanding of power 18 hours ago. Now, we will demonstrate ours. The transmission ended, leaving Thexkar staring at a blank screen, while processing implications that seemed to grow more complex with each passing moment. The assembled fleet had not declared war on the Zephyrian Empire, but they had declared something potentially more dangerous: independence from the entire system of dominance, and submission that allowed empires to exist in the first place. Commander, additional hyperspace emergence signatures detected, his tactical officer announced. This group appears to be different from the previous arrivals. Clarification: military vessels, Commander. Multiple species, but definitely warships rather than civilian craft. Current count is 23 vessels, with more arriving. Thexkar felt his understanding of the situation shift again. The appearance of military vessels changed the tactical calculation entirely. Civilian fleets could be ignored or avoided, but military forces required direct response according to established protocol. Species identification: mixed fleet, Commander, but all from species with formal mutual defense agreements with human colonies. Centaurian Defense Force, Valerian Patrol Service, Procyon Security Cooperative, and several smaller organizations. This was the development that Thexkar had been both expecting and dreading. The civilian mobilization had been unprecedented, but not directly threatening to Zephyrian military dominance. The arrival of formal military forces from multiple species represented a qualitatively different challenge, one that would require him to choose between escalation and withdrawal, with no middle options available. Communication from the military fleet, his communications officer announced. Admiral Tvana of the Valerian Defense Force is requesting direct conference. Admiral Tvana was a name that Thexkar recognized from intelligence briefings. She was considered one of the most capable military commanders in the Outer Rim, with a reputation for both tactical brilliance and diplomatic skill. Her presence in the Artemis system suggested that the situation had moved beyond spontaneous civilian response and into the realm of formal military intervention. Open the channel. The viewing screen activated to show a Valerian command bridge that was clearly military in design and operation. Admiral Tvana appeared as a tall, elegant figure whose feathers showed the deep blue coloration that marked her species' military caste. Her expression was formal, but not hostile, suggesting that she was prepared for negotiation as well as confrontation. Commander Thexkar, I am Admiral Tvana of the Combined Defense Fleet now present in this system. I am here to inform you that the civilian population of Colony Station Artemis 7 is now under the formal protection of the Mutual Defense Consortium, and that any further hostile action against these beings will be considered an act of war against all member species. Thexkar felt the last remnants of his strategic options disappearing. The Mutual Defense Consortium represented a formal military alliance of species that individually might not challenge Zephyrian dominance, but that collectively possessed sufficient firepower to make any confrontation extremely costly. More importantly, a war with the consortium would not be limited to the Artemis system. It would spread across the entire Outer Rim, potentially lasting for decades, and consuming resources that the Zephyrian Empire could not easily replace. Admiral Tvana, Colony Station Artemis 7 was in violation of established Zephyrian territorial claims. Our actions here were taken in accordance with recognized principles of imperial expansion and territorial sovereignty. Commander, the principles you reference are not recognized by the species represented in this system. We do not acknowledge any authority that includes the right to torture and murder children for purposes of intimidation. We do not accept territorial claims that are enforced through atrocities against civilian populations. Are you declaring war on the Zephyrian Empire? Admiral Tavana's expression remained carefully neutral, but her next words carried implications that would reshape the political balance of the galaxy. We are declaring our rejection of any authority based on the systematic intimidation of innocent populations. We are establishing new protocols for the protection of civilian populations that will be enforced by all consortium members. We are serving notice that attacks on children will be considered crimes against civilization itself, with consequences extending far beyond any single species or territory. The communication ended, leaving Thexkar alone with the realization that his routine compliance demonstration had triggered something unprecedented in galactic history. A single dead child had somehow catalyzed a transformation that would make the Zephyrian Empire's expansion impossible to continue and difficult to sustain. For the first time in his military career, Commander Thexkar was facing a strategic defeat that could not be reversed through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. The enemy had changed the rules of the game itself, and the new rules made his empire's survival dependent on principles that they had never accepted and could never embrace. The dragons had awakened something that was bigger than any of them had imagined, and now they would have to live with the consequences of what they had done to a 12-year-old girl who just wanted to understand the universe around her. The trial of Commander Thexkar took place 6 months after Emma Patterson's death, aboard the neutral station Haven's Rest, in a courtroom that had been specially constructed to accommodate representatives from 143 different species. The proceedings were unprecedented in galactic history. No international court had ever attempted to address crimes that crossed the boundaries of sovereign territories controlled by different species. No legal framework existed for prosecuting military commanders who had acted in accordance with their own empire's laws and traditions. No precedent could guide the judges who were attempting to balance justice with the complex realities of interspecies politics. But the Emma Patterson Memorial Foundation had created something new, a legal structure that prioritized the protection of innocence over the sovereignty of governments, and a moral framework that held individuals accountable for their actions regardless of the orders they had received or the cultures they represented. Commander Thexkar sat in the defendant's dock, his massive form making the specially constructed furniture appear inadequate despite the careful engineering that had gone into its design. He had aged visibly during the months since the Artemis incident, his scales dulled, and his bearing lacking the confident authority that had once marked him as one of the Zephyrian Empire's most successful military leaders. The charges against him were simple in their language, but complex in their implications. He was accused of ordering the torture and murder of a civilian child for the purpose of intimidating other civilians. He was charged with crimes against the fundamental principles of civilization. He was held responsible for actions that had been perfectly legal under Zephyrian law, but were considered atrocities by every other species present at the trial. The prosecution was led by Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had transformed herself from a research administrator into one of the galaxy's most effective advocates for the protection of civilian populations. She stood before the assembled court with the same calm determination that had marked her original address to the fleet at Artemis 7, but now her words carried the weight of legal precedent and institutional authority. Honorable judges, beings of conscience from across the galaxy, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the translation systems that allowed every species present to understand the proceedings. We are here today not to seek vengeance for the death of one child, but to establish principles that will prevent the deaths of countless other children in the future. Thexkar watched the judges carefully as Dr. Vasquez spoke. They represented 43 different species, chosen for their expertise in law, ethics, and interspecies relations. Some of them came from civilizations that had formal diplomatic relations with the Zephyrian Empire. Others represented species that had never encountered Zephyrians before the Artemis incident. All of them were tasked with creating legal precedents that would govern interspecies behavior for centuries to come. The defendant stands accused of ordering the torture and murder of Emma Patterson, a 12-year-old human child, for the stated purpose of demonstrating Zephyrian authority to the civilian population of Colony Station Artemis 7. This act was not committed in the heat of battle, not as a response to immediate threat, and not as an unfortunate consequence of military action. It was a deliberate, premeditated decision to inflict suffering on an innocent being for the purpose of terrorizing others into submission. Dr. Vasquez activated a holographic display that showed the interior of the station's assembly area during those terrible 36 minutes. The images had been enhanced and edited to protect the privacy of the victims while still demonstrating the nature of what had occurred. Thexkar found himself forced to watch his own actions from the perspective of the survivors, seeing for the first time how his orders had affected the people who were forced to witness their implementation. The defense will argue that Commander Thexkar was acting in accordance with the laws and customs of his own empire. They will claim that he was following orders from legitimate authority. They will suggest that judging his actions by the standards of other species is unfair and inappropriate. We reject these arguments absolutely. There are some actions that transcend the boundaries of cultural relativism. There are some behaviors that cannot be justified by reference to local customs or imperial authority. The deliberate torture and murder of children is one of those behaviors. Judge Mtara of the Andromedan Ethics Council, serving as the court's senior arbiter, spoke with the careful precision that marked her species' approach to complex moral questions. Dr. Vasquez, you are asking this court to establish legal precedents that supersede the sovereignty of individual species and empires. You are requesting that we create laws that apply universally, regardless of local customs or governmental structures. This is an extraordinary request that requires extraordinary justification. Your Honor, the justification is simple. Children are the future of every species. Their protection is not a luxury that can be set aside for the convenience of those in power. Their safety is not negotiable based on the political or military objectives of their elders. When we allow children to be harmed for any reason, we are deciding that our civilizations have no future worth protecting. Dr. Vasquez paused, looking around the courtroom at the assembled representatives of species that had never cooperated on anything of this scale before. The Emma Patterson Memorial Foundation has received support from species across the galaxy, not because they love humans, but because they love their own children and understand that protecting any child requires protecting all children. The foundation that had emerged from the crisis at Artemis 7 had indeed grown beyond anything its original creators had imagined possible. What had started as a spontaneous response to a single atrocity had evolved into a permanent institution with funding and support from hundreds of different worlds. The foundation operated schools, medical facilities, research institutions, and emergency response teams dedicated to the protection of young beings throughout the galaxy. More significantly, the Foundation had created a network of mutual obligations that connected species across vast distances and different political systems. When children were threatened anywhere in the galaxy, resources and support flowed to their protection with a speed and efficiency that surpassed anything achieved by formal military alliances or governmental agreements. The defense attorney, chosen by the Zephyrian Empire to represent their interests, was a being named Advocate Thresh, whose reputation for legal brilliance was matched only by his complete lack of emotional engagement with his clients. He approached the defendant's dock with the calculated precision that had made him successful in dozens of previous cases involving interspecies legal conflicts. Honorable judges, the prosecution asks you to establish laws that would make it impossible for any species to maintain order within their own territories. They ask you to replace the sovereignty of empires with the arbitrary moral judgments of coalition groups that have no formal authority and no responsibility for the consequences of their decisions. Thresh activated his own holographic displays, showing Zephyrian historical records that documented centuries of successful territorial management through established protocols. Commander Thexkar followed procedures that had been refined over generations of military service. These procedures have maintained peace and stability across vast regions of space by establishing clear boundaries and consistent consequences for those who violate them. The prosecution characterizes my client's actions as the torture and murder of an innocent child. I characterize them as the implementation of necessary discipline designed to prevent far greater suffering that would result from widespread rebellion and social collapse. The death of one individual, however tragic, must be weighed against the potential deaths of thousands that would result from failed territorial management. Fexcar listened to his attorney's arguments with growing unease. The legal logic was sound from a Zephyrian perspective, and the historical precedents were accurate. But sitting in a courtroom filled with representatives from species that had responded to his actions by fundamentally reorganizing their approach to interspecies cooperation, the traditional justification seemed increasingly hollow. Judge Tila of the Procyon Legal Institute asked the question,